The first letter came 2 days after Harold's funeral. Violation 001, printed in red. I stood on our porch, still wearing black, reading bureaucracy where sympathy should have been. That letter would mark the start of everything that followed. A fence, a feud, and the unraveling of a system that mistook intimidation for order. I'm Judge Miriam Blackwood. Pinewood Estates was once a quiet patchwork of porches, pickup trucks, and weekend barbecues. It was the kind of neighborhood where people borrowed tools instead of filing complaints. But the last decade brought change. Gleaming facades, manicured hedges, and homeowners armed with policy binders thicker than phone books. Progress, they called it. I called it precision control. Harold and I had planned a cedar fence 6 feet high for privacy, peace, and memory. After he passed, I built it alone, piece by piece, as therapy in motion. When Bryn Ashworth Sterling arrived in her Tesla, clipboard in hand, she claimed it violated community height restrictions. She measured it theatrically, declaring 6'2". Her tone was a gavel, not a neighbor's voice. I asked for the bylaw. She didn't have one. My licensed surveyor's report confirmed the fence met all codes. But truth wasn't her objective, leverage was. That night I opened an old case file. Sterling Premium Builders vs. State Island, 3 years prior. Her husband's company. Fraud, elder exploitation. I'd ruled against them. Now vengeance had a neighborhood, association, and letterhead. So I began what I knew. Best record-keeping, photos, dates, receipts, a timeline of paper that would outlast any tantrum. Pinewood's charm had changed, but evidence never does. That fence wasn't just a barrier of cedar and nails. It was the first exhibit in a case I hadn't meant to try, but one I was prepared to win. 2 weeks after that first letter, my mailbox turned into a courthouse. 7 certified envelopes in 10 days, each one a different accusation wrapped in authority. Violation 002, unapproved decorative stone. Harold's memorial marker. Violation 003, mailbox color non-compliant. The same black box that had stood for 70 years. Violation 004, excessive bird feeding. 1 feeder, 1 cardinal, 1 widow apparently guilty of compassion. Every notice came with fines, $25 here, $200 there, and threats of liens for continued defiance. None included the hearings Colorado law requires. None cited a rule that actually existed. I began treating them like evidence. Scanned, logged, cross-checked against the HOA's own bylaws. Section 12. The supposed height and decor clause wasn't even printed in their charter. Then the cameras caught Bryn herself conducting an emergency inspection flanked by a personal trainer and an interior designer, both wielding smartphones like subpoenas. They photographed through windows, composing a false record for a violation file that hadn't yet been written. Neighbors noticed the same script. Walt Henderson's flag deemed oversized. The Rodriguez family fined for a small Virgin Mary statue. Mrs. Daniels cited for children's chalk art. The targets shared 2 traits, history and humility. I filed a formal complaint with the Colorado Real Estate Commission. Dates, signatures, postage stamps, all in sequence. Her intimidation campaign had become my paper trail. In Pinewood Estates, control spoke through envelopes. I decided the reply would be exhibits. Tuesday morning, 10:12 a.m. Security footage caught Bryn entering through my side gate, phone raised like a badge. She moved with practiced entitlement, photographing windows, fence posts, even my garden hose. When she left, the latch hung open. At noon, HOA contracted landscapers arrived, wielding industrial leaf blowers. The noise rolled through the yard like a turbine. Gavel, Harold's old rescue tabby, bolted through that unlatched gate. He was gone before I could reach the porch. 48 hours later, I found him beneath a shed on Elm Street, ribs fractured, fur slicked with motor oil, eyes dull from dehydration. Dr. Martinez's report stated, injury consistent with mechanical impact or pursuit by machinery. The evidence was as cruel as it was clear. I changed every lock, installed 2 additional cameras, and filed criminal complaints for unlawful entry and animal cruelty. The footage, burned onto 3 drives, was delivered to law enforcement, media, and court. Channel 7 aired it that night. The sequence spoke for itself. Bryn entering, photographing, leaving the gate open, then the landscaper's engine screaming. The neighborhood reaction was immediate. Letters arrived from residents describing similar trespasses, coerced fees, damaged property, even inspections conducted without notice. Donations covered Gavel's care, along with dozens of messages signed simply, "We saw." It was never about fence height anymore. It was about boundaries of law, of decency, of intrusion disguised as authority. When Gavel limped home tail high, he carried more than scars. He carried proof. From that day, the record, not rage, became my weapon. Silence was no longer strategy. Documentation was. 3 weeks after the trespass, a courier delivered a thick envelope from the Judicial Discipline Commission. The accusations were staggering: abuse of judicial influence, retaliation against a private citizen, the complainant Bryn Ashworth Sterling. Attached were falsified photos showing a fence 2 feet higher than mine, along with witness statements from her personal trainer and decorator. It was a calculated smear, not a legal argument. By mid-afternoon, 3 blogs ran the headline: "Judge under investigation for HOA retaliation." The algorithm rewarded spectacle. For 72 hours I became clickbait. Then, on the 4th day, the counterweight arrived. Pat Donnelly, retired FBI agent, appeared at my door carrying a banker's box labeled Ashworth Patterns. Inside, insurance claims, property transfers, and damage reports filed under several names: Bryn Ashworth, Rebecca Sterling, Beth McKenzie, each linked to suspicious fires, floods, or vandalism events. Pat had been following her for years. The method was consistent: infiltrate homeowners associations, create disputes, claim damages, and collect inflated insurance settlements. Pinewood was simply her latest stage. The disciplinary complaint was diversion, to discredit me before the fraud surfaced. We turned my dining room into a war room. Evidence across the table, Harold's empty chair at its head. We mapped every alias, every payout, every falsified inspection. The fence had never been the issue. It was camouflage for a financial racket. By the end of the week, the narrative had reversed. I wasn't a vengeful judge. I was the obstacle between Bryn and her final payout. Evidence, not outrage, would settle it. Pat returned 5 days later with confirmation. Multiple aliases, 1 woman. Rebecca Ashworth, a California wildfire claim in 2010. Beth Sterling, an Arizona flood in 2012. Sandra McKenzie, a Detroit warehouse fire in 2014, connected to a federal inmate number. Each event followed the same rhythm: property acquired through shell HOA control, exaggerated damage reports, inflated valuations, and payout checks rerouted through consulting firms. Then silence, identity change, new state, new victims. We discovered Bryn's true origin in a redacted witness protection file from 2015. She'd entered under cooperation status for testifying in a real estate fraud case, then vanished from supervision within a year. Her relocation records ended in Denver County, exactly where Pinewood Estates appeared on the map. Pat outlined the list of offenses: mail and wire fraud, identity theft, money laundering, witness protection violation, and possibly RICO if multiple HOAs proved connected. Every term carried its own legal gravity, and every document in Pat's box made that gravity heavier. I spent the night building my own log: timestamps, statements, and evidence index numbers. The printer hummed like a metronome marking justice. By sunrise, the stack of printed pages measured nearly 6 feet, the same as the cedar fence that began it all. When I placed the final binder on top, I realized we were no longer compiling complaints. We were building a federal case file. Bryn had manipulated communities for a decade. This time her target happened to understand the rules of evidence. Within a week, my kitchen transformed into what Pat called the war room. Laptops lined the counter. Coffee never cooled. Every inch of corkboard carried printouts of bank statements, HOA minutes, contractor bids, and aerial maps marked with pins. Pat handled federal outreach. Rebecca Morgan, a former prosecutor turned private counsel, managed the civil coordination. Walt Henderson gathered neighbor affidavits recounting harassment and fabricated fines. Each statement added legitimacy and collective courage. Our plan formed 3 branches: federal, RICO, mail-in wire fraud, identity theft, state arson attempt, trespass, criminal mischief, and bribery. Civil, elder abuse and discriminatory enforcement under HOA governance laws. We filed injunctions to freeze HOA accounts and compelled document turnover. A motion for emergency protection ensured no retaliation against witnesses. Every action followed statute. No improvisation, no shortcuts. Meanwhile, we fortified the evidence chain. Cameras upgraded. Cloud backups established in triplicate. All video authenticated and notarized. Pinewood, once watched by fear, now watched for justice. The emotional rhythm inside that kitchen alternated between exhaustion and resolve. Walt joked that our coffee budget rivaled our legal fees. But no one left early. Evenings blurred into early mornings. Papers shuffled like courtroom echoes. I'd seen plenty of trials in my life, but none built from a kitchen table. Yet that's where most justice begins. Not with spectacle, but with people who refuse to be intimidated. By the end of that week, we weren't just defending a neighborhood. We were constructing the framework that would expose a national fraud ring. One timestamp, one affidavit, one late-night cup at a time. The next attempt came dressed as maintenance. On a calm Friday afternoon, 2 unmarked trucks rolled into Pinewood. Men in neon vests carried toolboxes labeled gas inspection. They moved efficiently, looping flexible hoses between my fence and Bryn's yard. The cameras, upgraded only days earlier, captured every angle. Their tools weren't for gas testing. They were installing propane lines feeding toward wooden mulch piles, tracing a pattern designed to mimic accidental ignition. Every joint sealed, every path disguised beneath soil. At 4:16 p.m., Bryn arrived, trailing a local news crew. She gestured dramatically toward my house, declaring to camera that ongoing safety violations endangered the neighborhood. Fire Marshal Jake Morrison arrived 10 minutes later on a resident tip. His body camera recorded it all. Unmarked equipment, unrequested inspection, and a telltale glint of accelerant residue. When Morrison declined to condemn the property, Bryn handed him a sealed envelope. He opened it mid-recording. Neatly stacked $100 bills. Attempted bribery caught in real time. The footage circulated through agency channels by nightfall. Federal investigators verified timestamp metadata, confirming authenticity. The attempted arson scene was no longer speculation. It was evidence. For years, Bryn had manipulated paper. Now paper and pixels united against her. Pinewood residents watched the clip in stunned silence. The HOA's president had just crossed the final legal threshold, from harassment to criminal conspiracy. That envelope became Exhibit A in what would soon unravel every identity she'd ever used. At 3:17 a.m. on October 12th, Pinewood's quiet was shattered. A thunderclap of shattering glass, then light, orange, devouring, unstoppable. My home was burning. Flames poured through the cedar boards Harold and I had built together. The fire moved with intelligence, like something rehearsed. It wasn't chaos. It was choreography. I wasn't there to see it. I was at Walt's house across the street, my bags packed on Pat's insistence. The camera system, the one we'd installed after the gas line incident, stayed behind. It became the witness I couldn't be. When I arrived just before dawn, firefighters were still cutting through embers. The air smelled of insulation and chemical residue, not just wood. I watched quietly, notebook in hand, as investigator Marcus Webb worked in his Tyvek suit, camera slung around his neck. He traced parallel burn paths leading from the garden toward the rear door. Accelerant tracks, deliberate, almost artistic in their symmetry. At noon, Webb called me aside. "Judge Blackwood, you need to see this." He held up the surviving data drive pulled from a charred security housing. The casing melted but the storage chip intact. Inside, time-stamped footage. The recording showed Bryn's husband entering through the side gate at 2:45 a.m., a silver fuel can glinting under motion lights. Minutes later, ignition. Then the smoking gun, a digital insurance submission at 2:30 a.m., 17 minutes before the first spark. I watched the playback in silence. Evidence doesn't shout. It simply waits. By morning, federal agents were at the scene cataloging fragments. Bryn arrived mid-afternoon with a news crew claiming negligence. Her expression froze when Webb showed the timestamp data. The cameras captured that too. Standing in the ashes, I realized the irony. Every document she'd used to weaponize order had now become proof of disorder. Flames erased walls, but not accountability. Harold's memorial fence survived, scorched but standing. It became the boundary between what she'd tried to destroy and what truth had already preserved. The morning after Webb's report hit Washington, dawn in Pinewood broke to the sound of engines. Not landscapers this time, but unmarked SUVs. Federal agents moved like clockwork. At 5:42 a.m., across 3 states, coordinated raids began. Through my window, I saw them approach Bryn's house. Blue jackets marked FBI and DOJ financial crimes. No shouting, no chaos, just controlled procedure. Walt stood beside me, coffee steaming in his hands, whispering, "Took long enough." Agents carried out boxes, file folders labeled Sterling Premium Builders, laptops, sealed envelopes of bank receipts. From another vehicle came a tech team with evidence scanners. They dismantled routers, imaged hard drives, sealed everything with numbered tags. Across the country, the same choreography unfolded. Phoenix, Austin, Denver, all tied through shell HOAs under Bryn's aliases. By mid-morning, 15 properties were under seizure orders. Pat received a call directly from the Bureau's Denver field office. Patterns confirmed. RICO predicates established. Your documentation built the map. Her eyes watered. Not from relief, but from exhaustion finally rewarded. By noon, headlines had filled national news cycles. Federal sweep targets HOA fraud network. Judge's evidence uncovers multi-state scheme. Reporters flooded Pinewood's entrance, but the neighborhood stayed calm. People opened blinds instead of closing them. For months they'd lived beneath intimidation letters and veiled threats. Now the power dynamic reversed. That afternoon I received the formal briefing packet. 15 arrest warrants executed, 12 property seizures, and over 30 frozen accounts. Bryn and her husband were in custody, held without bond pending arraignment. As agents cleared the final vehicles, the street felt different, lighter, but solemn. Justice doesn't bring celebration. It brings quiet balance. Walt placed a hand on my shoulder and said softly, "You gave the law its teeth back." Maybe, but I'd simply followed what Harold used to call the golden rule of truth. Document, then act. That morning, Pinewood finally belonged to its residents again. The courthouse steps were lined with cameras when I arrived. Reporters called my name, microphones extended, but I said nothing. In the halls of justice, silence is sometimes the loudest statement you can make. Courtroom 2B was standing room only. Victims, neighbors, officials, all drawn by the spectacle of accountability. Judge Patricia Morrison, my former colleague, presided. I took a seat beside Pat and Walt. The bailiff's voice echoed, Case 24-3817, United States versus Bryn Ashworth Sterling et al. Bryn entered in a gray suit, wrists cuffed, chin high. Her husband followed, eyes down. The clerk began reading. Defendant known under the aliases Rebecca Ashworth, Beth Sterling, Sandra Mackenzie. Each name stripped away another mask. Then came the charges. attempted murder of a federal judge, first-degree arson, mail fraud, wire fraud, insurance fraud, identity theft, witness protection violation, RICO conspiracy, and systematic civil rights violations. Assistant U.S. Attorney Amanda Stevens presented the evidence sequence: trespass footage, bribery body cam, accelerant photographs, time-stamped insurance claim, and recovered identity logs. Screens filled the courtroom walls with proof. No narrative, just data. When it ended, Bryn stood. Her voice shook with fury. "This is revenge. She's using her bench to destroy me." Judge Morrison's reply was surgical. "The facts will speak louder than your accusations." The prosecution moved to deny bond. Stevens cited multi-state flight risk, false identities, and the gravity of the offenses. The defense objected. The objection overruled. When the gavel struck, the courtroom exhaled. Victims wept quietly. Walt squeezed my hand, whispering, "That sound was for all of us." Outside, reporters shouted questions about motive and restitution. I gave none. In law, the record answers best. That night I sat at my desk and watched the footage again, not to relive pain but to remind myself of purpose. Justice, when it arrives, doesn't roar. It resonates. And sometimes it starts with offense. The jury deliberated 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Bryn Ashworth Sterling, convicted of fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. Life without parole, plus consecutive terms for related offenses. Her husband received 25 years. 3 accomplices pled and testified. Restitution totaled $3.2 million, distributed among victims across 15 HOAs. Federal investigators confirmed a multi-state scheme spanning a decade. A court-ordered oversight body created the first-ever HOA fraud registry, a public record to prevent repeat abuse. Back in Pinewood, order required reconstruction. Walt, our quiet electrician, assumed interim HOA presidency. His first decree, transparency. Budgets posted online, fines capped at reasonable limits, mediation required before litigation. He renamed the HOA office the Commons, a place for communication, not control. Reform rippled outward. State legislators passed the Pinewood Protection Act, mandating financial audits, open elections, and whistleblower protections in all Colorado associations. Within a year, 15 states adopted similar measures. When I signed the petition to make it law, I noticed the final count: 612 signatures, one for every home in Pinewood. The irony struck me. For years, Bryn had ruled through fear and silence, and now every resident's name stood together on the same page. That signature list became my favorite legal document, not because of my victory, but because it represented a community finally in agreement. That authority must serve, not intimidate. Pinewood rebuilt itself from the ashes, literally. The scorched foundation of my home became the Harold Blackwood Memorial Garden, planted with cedar and wildflowers, funded entirely by restitution. Law students visit each spring to study community restoration as living jurisprudence. The American Bar Association established the Blackwood Award for Judicial Integrity. I accepted it quietly, then donated the stipend to the Gavel Trust, a scholarship for first-generation law students. The first recipient, Maria Rodriguez, once fined by Bryn for a front-yard sculpture. She now clerks in the district court. Pat Donnelly lectures at Quantico, using the case to teach paper trail counterfraud. Walt still mows lawns at sunrise, saying order and empathy can coexist when rules are written in sunlight, not secrecy. Every year, Pinewood holds the Justice Festival, replacing HOA meetings with storytelling and civic workshops. Laughter fills the same cul-de-sacs where threats once traveled by mail. My fence still stands 6 feet, no higher, no lower. It's not defiance. It's remembrance. Gavel sits atop it most afternoons, eyes half closed, guarding peace the way he once fled chaos. When people ask what justice feels like, I tell them quieter than victory, steadier than revenge, measured like a fence by what it protects, not what it excludes. The camera pans across Pinewood at sunset. My closing words. The first letter came 2 days after Harold's funeral. The last arrived from federal court, stamped case closed. If you believe accountability matters, share this story. One click helps others see how power should answer to truth. Like the video if you stand for fairness, and if you believe every neighbor deserves justice.